Hi there, this is Eshu. There's no Dharma talk from the Zendo this week. UVic facilities management was in cleaning the carpets on Sunday, so our usual sit was cancelled. I didn't want to leave you hungry though, so I thought I'd offer this reflection instead. And to be very clear, this is not a Dharma talk. I'll just be reading some of my own thoughts that seemed important enough to me to take the time to write down. It's not doctrine, and it's certainly not the law, so you're free to take what works for you and just leave the rest. This reflection is part of the same thread that I've been tugging at in my recent posts about Zen and money and the quiet decline of practice centers. But it runs even deeper into how Zen itself was quietly reshaped when it came west. I sometimes call this process de-animation. By that I mean taking a living, relational, spirit-filled world, one that's alive with ancestors and local gods and hungry ghosts and protective spirits of temples and mountain paths, and slowly flattening it into something abstract, philosophical, or purely psychological. So how did that happen? Well, some of it happened unintentionally. Many of the people who brought Zen to North America in the 60s and 70s were trained as doctors and psychologists and academics. They were brilliant and sincere and committed, but they also carried worldviews that were shaped by Protestant Christianity and English-speaking colonial cultures that are by their nature suspicious of ritual and dismissive of spirits, deeply invested in the idea that real truth is only found in the mind, or at best, the mind calming the body. So it was almost inevitable that Zen would be interpreted through those lenses. But some of it, I think, was also quite deliberate. These early Western Zen adopters were trying to introduce something radically foreign into societies that were, and still largely are, dominated by Christian and post-Enlightenment assumptions. So talking about local kami, wrathful dharmapalas, or feeding hungry ghosts was not exactly a recipe for social legitimacy. It might get you written off as naive, superstitious, or even worse. So Buddhism, and Zen specifically, was carefully framed as a philosophy, or a psychology, or a way to manage stress or cultivate clarity. It was made respectable, a kind of elegant minimalism for the mind. And that strategy, well, it's worked. Zen has found its place in universities and hospitals, in therapy circles, and even in the dinner parties of the social elite. But what was lost? But this strategy also quietly aligned itself with the work of colonialism. It stripped practice from its roots in place, ancestors and spirits, and especially reciprocity. Land became resources, or at best, scenery, not presence. Ancestors became about biological ancestry, DNA, institutional systems, and sometimes even nationalism, rather than being about the kin we feed and who help us to carry our burdens. The Dharma hall became an aesthetic exercise, spare walls and cushions and brush paintings, rather than a living crossroads of beings both seen and unseen. And what's fascinating is that even in their drive to make Zen acceptable to Western psychology and rationalism, many teachers still kept the traditional rituals, the chanting of dharanis to invoke protective beings and bodhisattvas and to prevent disasters, the ceremonies to feed hungry ghosts, the offerings of incense and food. But then they bent over backwards to explain them in purely psychological terms, or as literary devices, or at best as poetic metaphors for working with the subconscious human mind. And it was a clever solution. But it also meant that the world stayed flat. The ancestors weren't truly ancestors. The hungry ghosts weren't truly beings that could impact our lives. The land didn't speak back. All of it was safely contained within our own minds. Even the recitation of lineage, listing out the Dharma ancestors from Shakyamuni and the 7 ancient Buddhas all the way down to our own teachers, it was meant to be an act of profound relational acknowledgement. It said, I stand here because of these countless lives and vows. I am part of this great family. But here, too, something quietly shifted. In many Western contexts, lineage began to function less as a living network of Dharma kin and more like academic credentials, a way of proving you had the right papers. A person's lineage became their resume, not a declaration of their living kinship and interdependent relationships. Now, I don't write any of this to sneer at the past. I also want to be clear that I'm not just pointing fingers at some anonymous early Western Zen teachers here. I'm very much part of this story. When I first stepped into Zen, I don't know that I could have accepted a fully animist, relational Zen practice. And for years, if you've been listening to this podcast, you know I absolutely taught and explained the chants, the beings, the realms, all through that same metaphorical, psychological lens. It's taken decades for me to truly grasp that the throngs of beings who attended the Buddha's teachings on Vulture Peak, or the quaking of the earth when he gave voice to the Dharma, are not just quaint literary devices or metaphors. They belong to aspects of reality that most of us simply haven't learned to perceive, in spite of having the innate capacity to do so. If those early teachers hadn't found ways to make Zen acceptable in this context, I probably wouldn't have encountered it myself. So I'm deeply grateful to them. And I understand why they chose the framing they did. For many, it must have seemed the only way for the Dharma to survive, let alone flourish. But I also think we're living in the long shadow of that strategy. We find ourselves now surrounded by a Zen that's elegant, minimal, and at the same time, strangely empty, and I don't mean that in a good way. It's a Zen that talks about letting go of attachments, but often forgets to ask who or what we're attached to, and whether or not we might have obligations and responsibilities to them beyond ourselves. It's a Zen that values silence and simplicity, but often doesn't know how to bow to the old powers of the land, or offer nourishment to the dead, or leave offerings at the crossroads and byways. For me, this isn't about importing Asian spirits. We couldn't even if we tried, onto hills that are already ancient, and indeed already occupied by their own long-standing spirits and caretakers. Nor is it about romanticizing someone else's traditions. It's about remembering that practice was never meant to be purely internal or abstract. It's always been about relationship. With people, yes, but also with place, with ancestors, with the countless seen and unseen beings we share the world with. So I'm trying, little bit by little bit, to let some of that back in, to let my practice re-animate, to listen to the land that I'm on and to the people who have been in relationship with this land since time out of mind. I've learned how to make offerings, how to acknowledge the dead who walk with me. It's small, and it's messy, and I get it wrong as often as I get it right, but it feels more honest than pretending that Zen was ever meant to be a clean, rational exercise in individual self-betterment. If any of this resonates with you, or even if it troubles you, I'd be glad to hear about it. Because for all its reputation for rugged independence, Zen has always been about companionship on the way. So thanks for listening today. May we all keep fumbling towards something more whole, more woven together, something more alive. Thanks for listening to Living Zen. This podcast is completely free, and I'd really love to keep it ad-free. One small way that you can help is by leaving a rating or a review. It actually makes a huge difference, helping other people, maybe folks practicing far from a Zen center, to find these teachings and breathe life and connection into a solitary practice. If you'd like to go deeper, you can support this work and get early access to talks and extra reflections over on our Patreon at Red Mountain Way. If you're looking for a living Zen community, visit zenwest.ca. There's a free online orientation to Zen there, plus ways to sit with us. And if you want more personal guidance, I also work one-on-one through Monarch Trance Work. Blessings on your way, and thanks for being here.